In this video, I'll be showing you how to seam stockinette stitch. I'll be showing you how to seam vertically and horizontally. So let's get started. I'm going to use the end of the yarn that's actually attached to my knitting. So most of the time when you're seaming your work, you can utilize the ends that you've had from the actual knitting. So thread your tapestry needle like this. And now I usually work this way so that I'm sewing this way. So when you look at your piece of knitting, there's lots of individual rows that you can seam into. Generally, I wouldn't advise seaming into the very first line of stitches. I would advise going one in and seaming into this row of stitches. So to start with, we need to connect the two pieces together. So I try to find the very corner stitch here and then sew through there. So we've got a first seaming stitch. Then we're going to actually work from the right side of the work. So this will create an invisible seam from the outside. So let's pretend this is the front and the back piece of a jumper and we're seaming them together. So you don't want to be working from the wrong side of the work because your seam will end up facing outwards. You want your seam to face inwards, so we're going to work from the right side. So firstly, like I said, don't seam into the very first row of stitches, seam into the one behind. So we're going to go in, and I usually seam across two bars. See there where there's two bars of stitches? Rather than do every bar individually. There's not a right and a wrong way. You can do every bar individually if you want, but I tend to do two at a time. So we'll do our first stitch like that. Don't pull it too tight on this first one. And then again, we want to go back into the other side. So not this first one of stitches, the one behind. And we want to pick up two bars. Split the yarn there. Two bars of yarn like that. So sew through that one. And now you can start to pull a little bit tighter to start getting those to sit next to each other. And then you want to go back in where your last stitch came out of. So into that hole and pick up two bars. So see there's two bars of yarn. And then go back in where your last stitch came out of on the other side and pick up two bars. See there where there's two bars? And essentially continue to do that. So you can start to pull a little bit tighter, and as you work you'll see that you're actually creating what looks like an invisible seam. And if you're using chunky yarn like me, you can really start to see that coming together. So see here where that's created almost an invisible seam. I'll come a little bit closer. Light there. It just looks like another run of stitches. So you just carry on going into the hole that your last stitch came out of, pick up two bars, and then do the same on the other side. Careful not to split the yarn. And again, you don't want to pull too tight. Just pull enough so it mirrors the tension of your knitting. And it's always better to keep it looser and then pull it tight after. So once it's like this, you can just give it a little tug and it'll all tighten up along there. And then keep going. I may not have enough yarn to actually finish seaming this part. Until you reach the end. And then once you get to the very end, you can just weave in your ends. So there. That is how you seam stockinette vertically. Okay, so I've just unpicked that because now I'm going to show you how to seam horizontally. So this is what you would use if you were, say, joining the front and the back piece of a jumper on the shoulder seam here. So for this, I'm going to use some contrasting yarn just so you can see what I'm doing. So we'll pretend that this yarn is joined. So we finish knitting and this is the end of our knitted yarn. So again, you want to go into that very first corner just to connect the two pieces together, like so. And then we're actually going to be seaming on the cast off edge, which typically for my patterns is what you end up doing. So we're not going to show the cast off, we want to hide that. So rather than go into the middle of the cast off edge here, we're going to go into the first row of stitches behind the cast off edge. And you want to go into the very first stitch. So see, this is the very first stitch here. Go into that hole. And then again, we're going to pick up 2 bars. So see here where you've got the 2 bars. We're going to go through there. Then we're going to go back into the second piece of knitting. So again, this is your very first stitch here. So we're going to go into that hole and we're going to pick up 2 bars. Now don't worry if you can see the yarn at this point, because once we've got a few stitches in place, we can tighten it. So we go back in to where our stitch came out of, and we're going to pick up 2 bars of yarn again. And then again, back into where our stitch came out of, and we're going to pick up 2 bars. Tail out the way, and at this point you can start to pull a little bit tighter and you'll start to see your yarn disappear. So again, back into where our stitch came out of and pick up 2 bars. And when you're doing any seaming, you can use this principle of picking up the 2 bars on both sides and just continuing, and 9 times out of 10 that will give you an invisible seamless seam. Again, pick up those 2 there, and like I say, you don't have to pull tight every time as you go. You can just stitch for a little while and then pull it tight in one run, just until you're sure that your stitches are in the right place. And that's another tip. When you're pulling it tight, don't just pull, hold the edge and pull like that, because what that will do, it will stop the yarn from running through, and it will also stop your knitting sort of scrunching up like this, because you can hold it taut where you want it to be in terms of tension. Go back in, pick up 2 bars, and just carry on until you get to the edge of your knitting. This is also a really good way to make sure that you're matching your sides up. If you're using a more complicated stitch pattern where you need to match your pattern up either side, this really helps to do that, because you can clearly see whether the stitches are matching up or not. I think one of these swatches is slightly wider than the other, so it won't necessarily match up exactly. Just keep going. Yeah, I've got 1 extra stitch on this bottom swatch, so we'll just ignore that. So see there where you can see those stitches, you just hold the end and just give it a little tug, and then they all disappear. So even though I've used a contrasting yarn colour, you can see how invisible that becomes. And that would be maybe your shoulder on a jumper or cardigan. There's many different reasons you could seam horizontally. So I hope this video has helped to understand how to seam stockinette horizontally and vertically. See you in the next one. Bye.